Hi, everybody. Tonight, what I'm going to talk about is the country of Russia. I didn't have anybody come in, I'm going to go ahead and get started. So, Russia is one of our six core countries, and the framework for which we will use to analyze this country is we'll start with a geography and some key institutions, including Russia's democratic government, the political culture in terms of legitimacy, ideology, racism, equality, and security, the different patterns of interaction, and particularly the reformers and versus the conservatives issue, and the president versus the parliament issue. Finally, we'll look at what Russians quarrel about, including reforming the old Soviet Union, the lost republics, and the economy. I'm going to increase this and then move my slide. Okay, so let's start off with an overview of Russia. So the Soviet Union ceased to exist at the end of 1991, and in the aftermath of the fall, Russia, as it's now called, set up a federal system of government with a bicameral parliament, a semi-presidential system, a split electoral system, and from the outside it had all the makings of a democracy, but the collapse of the communist regime did not bring about liberal democracy or free market prosperity. Instead, it brought monumental lawlessness and poverty. So under the Soviet Union, the Russian society was very weak. In fact, it had been made deliberately weak and could not sustain a free democracy. Russia political culture has left a stain that is not easily removed. Many Russians are natural egalitarians that gravitate toward an authoritarian government to feel secure. And so my question is, can these attitudes be unlearned? Can Russia change its political culture? So let's take a look at the impact of the past. So modern Russians descend from the early groups of the Slavs who settled along the rivers of what is known, what are today the Ukraine and Russia. Following a period of conquest by the Mongols, a series of Russian rulers began to expand their control over the land we now know as Russia. So these emperors, who were called czars, ruled Russia from 1480 to 1917. In 1917, Vladimir Lenin led the Russian Revolution and set up a communist-style state, later which became known as the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and Russia again became an independent country. So here are some differences. Russia, under this communist system, didn't necessarily have a state religion, but most of Russians fall into either one of these categories right here. And so as we're moving through, take a note of these different questions. What was life like under the czars? What was life like under communist rule? And how did the Soviet model differ from Marxism? When looking at the key institutions, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russians approved a new constitution, but they had no democratic traditions. That's important to note. In the 1990s, economic hardships and political turmoil increased. Many Russians feared the growing chaos and longed for a return to order. Some would say President Vladimir Putin is restructuring the federation back to a Soviet-style government. Several measures Putin has installed to devolve power unequally across the country can be found in this chart here. As a result of all these changes, the federation is highly centralized. So here we have some of these changes that were made by Putin, the super districts, the removal of governors, appointment of governors, changes in the federal council, and the elimination of single-member districts seats in the Duma. So let's talk about political culture. Russian citizens are affected by many contradictory influences from their political culture. Most support the idea of a democratic government for Russia, although they don't believe that one exists today. They do, however, like the idea of a strong state and powerful political leaders. The Russian Federation has many societal cleavages that greatly impact policymaking, including nationality, social class, rural, urban divisions. However, the most important is nationality. Although the majority of people in Russia are Russian, also included are sects of the Tatars, the Ukrainians, the Armenians, Chuvash, the Bashkirs, the Turkic people, the Belarusians, and the Moldavians. So these cleavages determine the organization of the country into a federation with autonomous regions. For example, the breakaway republics in 1991, many would like to have their independence. Okay, what I'd like to do now is show you a video quickly. There we go. And I would like to just, let me do that. To give you more information about Russia and its history. So this is not 29 minutes. It's going to be shorter than that, but let's see what we have to say here.
Today, Russia is the world's largest country. Early in its history, however, it was a small territory on the edge of Europe. Strong rulers gradually expanded Russia's borders. Their harsh rule led to unrest, eventually leading to two major upheavals, one in 1917 and the other in 1991. Midway through the 9th century, the Slavs, or people from the forests north of the Black Sea, began trading with Constantinople. As they traded, they began absorbing Greek and Byzantine ideas. Russian culture grew out of this blending of Slavic and Greek traditions. Russians, Ukrainians, Poles, Czechs, Slovaks, Serbs, Croats, and Bulgarians can be differentiated by the way languages are written. The Western Slavs, which include Poles, Czechs, and others, were Christianized from Rome, hence their alphabet is Latin. The Eastern Slavs, which include Russians, Ukrainians, Serbs, and others, were converted by Eastern Orthodox monks from Constantinople, and their language is written in a variation of the Greek alphabet called Cyrillic. From the start, this difference in language sets Russia apart from the rest of Europe. The early Slavs built a civilization around the city of Kiev, today the capital of Ukraine. By the 1000s, the ruler and people of Kievan Russia had accepted Eastern Orthodox Christianity. In the 1200s, the Mongols swept in from Central Asia and conquered Kiev. Moscow became the center of the new Slavic territory called Muscovy. In 1480, Ivan III, a prince of Muscovy, drove out the Mongols and made Muscovy independent. He was known as Ivan the Great, and is pictured on the left. Muscovy slowly developed into a country we know today as Russia. Russian rulers expanded their power, built up armies, and seized land and other resources. They called themselves czars or emperors. They had total control over the government. Tsar Ivan IV who ruled during the 1500s, was known as Ivan the Terrible because he used a secret police force to tighten his iron grip on the people and control their lives. He is pictured on the right. Subsequent czars gradually conquered surrounding territories. As a result, many non-Russian peoples became part of the growing Russian Empire. Today, Russia still suffers from ethnic tensions caused by these early conquests. Tsars such as Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, pictured here, pushed the empire's borders southward and westward. They also tried to make Russia modern and more like Europe. Peter built a new capital, St. Petersburg, in the early 1700s. Built close to Europe, near the Baltic coast, St. Petersburg was designed like a European city, with elegant palaces, public squares, and canals. In addition, most Russian nobles spoke French and wore European-style clothes. Nobles enjoyed rich, comfortable lives. At the bottom of society, however, were the great masses of people. Most were serfs or farm laborers who could be bought or sold along with the land. These people lived hard lives, working on the nobles' country estates or in city palaces. Few could read or write and did not know Western culture, but kept the Russian traditions. In the late 1800s, Russia entered a period of economic and social change. The Russian Empire expanded southward into the Caucasus Mountains and eastward towards the Pacific Ocean. In 1861, Tsar Alexander II, known as the Tsar Liberator, freed the serfs from being tied to the land. His new law did little to lift them out of poverty, though. Russia began to industrialize as railroads, including the Trans-Siberian Railroad, spread across the country. The Trans-Siberian Railroad linked Moscow in the west with Vladivostok on Russia's Pacific coast. By the 1890s, some revolutionists in Russia were Marxists, who were in exile along with other dissidents. According to Marxism, socialist revolutions would first take place not in Russia, but in capitalist countries like Germany, France, and England. In his 1905 pamphlet, What is to be Done, Lenin changed the meaning of Marxism when he argued for democratic centralism, or a vanguard leadership group that would lead the revolution in the name of the people. Lenin believed that the situation in Russia was so bad that a Russian Revolution would occur even though it was not a highly industrialized society. In 1914, World War I broke out in Europe. Russian and German armies met and fought bloody battles in Eastern Europe. Unprepared for war, Russia suffered many defeats and had few victories. As the fighting dragged on, shortages of food in Russian cities caused starvation. Russian soldiers were fighting without guns or shoes, and mass defections from the war front helped send the state into chaos. The Russian people blamed czars for their troubles. After a 1918 civil war between the White Army, which consisted of Russian military leaders and was funded by the Allied powers, and the Red Army, which was led by Lenin, the Red Army won. In 1920, Lenin instituted his new economic policy, which allowed a great deal of private ownership to exist under a centralized leadership. This brought prosperity to farmers, but did not promote industrialization. Lenin is pictured on the left. Stalin, who is pictured on the right, vastly changed Lenin's democratic centralism, which also is known as Marxism-Leninism. Stalin placed the Communist Party at the center of control and allowed no other political parties to compete with it. He set up a central committee group of 300 party leaders that met twice a year. Above the central committee was the Politburo, which was a group of 12 men that ran the country. Their decisions were carried out by government agencies and departments. The Head was the general secretary, which was Stalin, who assumed full power as dictator of the country. This lasted from 1927 to 1953. Collectivization and industrialization were implemented. Stalin replaced the NEP with collective farms that were state-run. Private land ownership was done away with, and the farms were intended to feed workers in the city who contributed to the industrialization of the nation. Stalinism, which was a combination of collectivization and industrialization, which was carried out by central planning and executed with force and brutality. In the area of foreign policy, Stalin's primary goal was internal development, mainly industrial development of the USSR, so his foreign policy was intended to support that goal. Stalin signed a non-aggression pact with Nazi Germany in 1939, only to be attacked by Germany the following year. Russia then joined sides with the Allies for the duration of World War II. Tensions were always high between East and West, and soon as the war ended, the Cold War escalated. In 1953, Stalin died, and his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, set about to reform Stalinism by loosening its totalitarian rule. He first denounced the purges that had been ordered by Stalin, which was the execution of millions of citizens, including his own generals, with whom Stalin felt was disloyal to the party. Khrushchev denounced Stalin's rules and practices and sponsored a process called de-Stalinization that led to reforms such as loosening government censorship of the press, decentralization of economic decision-making, and restructuring of the collective farms. Khrushchev was criticized for these reforms and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who ended the reforms. After Brezhnev died in 1982, he was replaced by a young reformer, Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev was unlike any previous Soviet leader in that he not only looked and acted more Western, but he also was more open to Western-style reforms. The key institutions of Russia. Pictured here, you see where the Russian Duma makes laws. This building is known as the White House. The Soviet system, started by Lenin and perfected by Stalin, lasted into Gorbachev's tenure. The system changed over time, but not much. Its main structural features were the Politburo, a small top governing body, the Central Committee, and the Security Police, sometimes called the Secret Police. Security police are highly political and focus on preventing any criticism, dissent, or movements that might harm the regime. They often use terror as a key element. During Stalin's time, this was very much the truth, but after Stalin, terror, the fear of being arbitrarily arrested, imprisoned, sent to Siberia, or shot, receded as a means of political control. The security police were later called the KGB, or the Committee on State Security. The Soviet Union was a federation long dominated by the center. The bureaucracy, monstrous, with 18 million people administering every aspect of Soviet life. The State Planning Committee, or Gosplan, was the nerve center of the Soviet economic system. It established how much of what was produced each year. Under Stalin, it enabled the Soviet Union to industrialize quickly, but it also meant chronic shortages of items the Gosplan ignored. Mikhail Gorbachev was a reformer from a younger generation. He was open to Western-style reforms and implemented a three-pronged program that included glasnost, which translates from the Russian openness. It allowed more open discussion of political, social, and economic issues, as well as open criticism of the government. Another reform was democratization. Gorbachev believed that he could keep the old Soviet structure, including Communist Party control, but at the same time insert a little democracy into the system. He created a new Congress of People's Deputies which was directly elected representatives and a new position of president that was selected by the Congress. Finally, there was perestroika. This economic reform was Gorbachev's most radical and also his least successful. Again, he tried to keep the Soviet structure while transferring economic powers held by the central government to private hands and the market economy. In 1991, those that wanted to abandon Gorbachev's reforms from within the Politburo led a coup d'etat that tried to remove Gorbachev from office. The leaders included the vice president and the head of the KGB. The coup failed when popular protests broke out and soldiers from the military defected rather than support their leaders. Protesters were led by Boris Yeltsin. Gorbachev was restored to power, but the USSR only had a few months to live. By December 1991, 11 republics had declared their independence, and eventually Gorbachev was forced to announce the end of the Union, which put him out of a job. There are 15 ex-Soviet republics. There is a bicameral parliament, which consists of a lower house. The State Duma consists of 450 deputies elected for up to 4 years. They pass bills, approve the budget, and confirm the president's nominees for top jobs. The upper house, which is the Federation Council, consists of 2 members named by each of the 89 regional governments. There's a constitutional court with 19 judges appointed by the president and confirmed by the upper house. It also calls for a split electoral system, which half of the Duma's 450 seats are elected by proportional representation, half by single-member districts with a plurality win. For years, the Soviet Union tried to convince its citizens that the government was legitimate and that it had the right to rule. Gorbachev's glasnost freed the media from fear of the police, and in turn the media began to criticize the bureaucracy, the party, and the corruption of both. The mask of Soviet legitimacy slowly slipped away. But what would replace the Soviet system? Many wanted a cleaned-up version of socialism, whereas better educated individuals favored free politics and economics. The idea behind Marxism-Leninism was that the building of socialism would at a certain point surpass the United States and turn into a communist utopia with no social or economic problems. In the early years, many believed this thought, but young people soon started joining the party as a means to attend university and get jobs. They became cynical and were motivated by careers and not ideology. In a civil society, everything is bigger than the family, but smaller than the government. Churches, businesses, or associations, etc. The crux of the Soviet system was the stomping out of society by the state. Since the fall of communism, Russia has struggled to rediscover a civil society. The sudden imposition of democratic institutions and a market economy were once thought to bring on a civil society for Russia. However, now we see that without the philosophical, moral, economic, and legal understanding of civil society, Russia trends back to authoritarianism. Many Russians favor extreme equality and natural socialism. Americans also favor equality, but it is equality of opportunity. In other words, everyone has a chance. The results are up to you. An American who gets ahead is usually applauded for their hard work and ability. Most Russians do not understand this kind of equality. They expect equality of result, with each person collecting the same rewards. Russians tend to categorize everyone on the basis of their nationality. Some nationalities are acceptable and others are despised. Russians, for example, respect the Baltic peoples as Europeans, civilized and cultured. On the other hand, Russians speak scathingly of the Muslim Turkic peoples of the Caucasus and Central Asian areas. Conservatives in Russia covers a broad range of moderates to extremists who have one thing in common, which is their opposition to restructuring the Russian economy, favoring an old-line party of centralized command economy. Reformers such as Khrushchev and Gorbachev attempted economic reforms and failed. Khrushchev stressed consumer goods over heavy industry, which infuriated managers in the military. Gorbachev introduced perestroika, which slowly began to decentralize and liberalize the Soviet economy, but the Soviet elites sabotaged the reforms. As president, Putin created a handful of youth movements to support the government. The largest is Nashi. Nashi organized mass marches in support of Mr. Putin and staged demonstrations over foreign policy issues. Opponents of the organization call it a modern version of Komsomol, the youth wing of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Nashi receives grants from the government and large state-run businesses, so critics of the group see it as an arm of an increasingly authoritarian state. The main question asked by people outside Russia is, will the Russian Federation fall apart? As we have established, old habits die hard, and Russians feel most comfortable with a center-planned and controlled economy. The resistance and tensions faced by those who sought to reform are faced by Putin today. While the Soviet system was in place, Russia lagged behind the Western countries in technology and efficiency of factory production. Although citizens desperately saw the need for economic reform, conservatives within the party shut down any attempts at change. The reforms that Gorbachev attempted were a middle way between capitalism and socialism. He was never able to implement economic policies, and even when he was thrown out of office, Yeltsin was not able to fully restructure the economic system. In many ex-Soviet republics, the new leaders are old party big shots and rule by a corrupt and authoritarian means. Some want to see the old empire restored. Many are concerned for the millions of ethnic Russians who live in the near abroad and who feel threatened while being a minority in these republics. However, a recovery of the lost republics could come in the way of economics. As the economies of other republics plunge downward, some turn desperately to Moscow for help. The biggest problem in Russia is that many want a middle path between a centrally planned socialist economy and a free market economy.
Okay, that was kind of long-winded, but I think it gave a really good overview of our country of Russia. So as you are looking at Russia and comparing it to the other countries, keep the history in mind, keep the people in mind, and keep the political system that exists today in mind when you're answering questions. Nobody came to my session tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and end it there, but thank you for listening, and I will see you next week.